Good morning, and welcome to the fifth hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Solvency Multi-Employer Pension Plans. The committee has taken a rigorous approach to the issues before it, examining the public hearings, the complex range of problems that have led to the dire financial condition of a significant number of multi-employer pension plans, as well as of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation or what we call the PBGC. According to the PBGC, here is where we stand with regard to funding. For 2015, the plans are underfunded by a total of $638 billion, with a B, billion dollars. Almost 75% of multi-employer plan participants are in plans that are less than 50% funded. More than 95% are in plans that are less than 60% funded. But if you look at them on an actuarial basis, using the plan's proclaimed discount rates, they are 80% funded and only have a $120 billion shortfall. The difference between these numbers should keep us up at night. Everyone knows the plans are in dire straits, but by using unrealistic assumptions, the true extent of the problem is hidden until it's too late. Indeed, these numbers have kept this committee properly busy. The committee and its staff have held dozens of meetings with stakeholders, and we are continuously bringing in experts to brief our team. This has been an intensive, time-consuming, but worthwhile exercise. And these briefings and discussions will continue because I believe it is important that the committee leave no stone unturned in discussing how we may address the conditions of the multi-employer plans. In addition to the great deal of work that has gone into understanding the system and its challenges, the committee staff has started to consider a range of policy ideas to address the challenges faced by the multi-employer system. They have started to crunch numbers on these ideas, reviewing them, and looking at the complex interactions of the legal requirements of the current system and the proposals for change. This is all complicated stuff, somewhat like playing three-dimensional chess. A lot of work still needs to be put into this process, but at this point, the committee is not taking anything off the table, not necessarily putting anything on the table for consideration either. But it is necessary and prudent to begin conducting in-depth due diligence on these ideas. Excuse me. During this morning's hearing, we continue to work on understanding the current system by hearing more from stakeholders in the system. We have brought in 4 witnesses today to help us. The first is a retiree in an at-risk program who will share his perspective as a participant. We've also brought in 2 respected academics and a practitioner with years of experience in the system who will review for us some fundamentals of these plans and share their views on what does and does not work. Their perspective is important because clearly the system is, in certain aspects, flawed. Our witnesses today will help us delve into some key questions. What is at stake here for retirees? What is the appropriate measurement of plan funding? Are the plans generally healthy or not? What major structural reforms are needed? And one issue in which I am most interested, are federal taxpayers responsible under current law for funding any PBGC shortfalls? Let me now turn to Senator Brown, who I'm very appreciative of, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Hatch. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your continued work in this committee. I appreciate the relationship we've built over the years, and first on the Help Committee, then on the Finance Committee, and the work that we are doing jointly in this, and we all know how important it is that we succeed. I want to thank Senator Johnson and Senator Baldwin for joining us They will introduce one of our witnesses, Kenneth Stribling, who sits at the table, whom Tammy introduced me to one day in the hallway. And we've seen Mr. Stribling as we've seen Rita Lewis and so many others walking the halls, and mine workers walking the halls of Congress, fighting for themselves, but especially fighting for their brothers and sisters in the trade union movement. I want to thank members of the committee, a number of you who joined Senator Portman and me 2 weeks ago in Ohio for our field hearing. Mike Walden, who's sitting behind Tammy, was one of our witnesses at that hearing. It was particularly important for us to hear the perspectives of the workers and retirees and small business owners who have the most to lose if Congress doesn't do its job. Roberta Dell works at Spangler Candy Company in Bryan, Ohio. She put it pretty succinctly. She said, as nothing is done, a lot of us will go belly up. That's the bottom line. We know the same could be said, the same could be true for small businesses. Bill Martin, the president of Spangler Candy in Northwest Ohio, explained, quote, in central states, the vast majority of the 1,300 contributing employers are small businesses like us. This issue hinders the success and growth of our businesses who already struggle to be competitive. These businesses and their employees did everything right. They contributed to these pensions in many cases over decades and decades. They're the ones whose lives and livelihoods will be devastated if Congress doesn't do its job. When I think about the responsibility the 16 of us have, I think about the words of Larry Ward at that hearing at the State House in Columbus. He said, I don't understand how it is that Congress would even consider asking us to take a cut to my pension or see it go away entirely when it had no problem sending billions to the Wall Street crooks who caused this problem in the first place. They use that to pay themselves bonuses. We use our pensions to pay for medicine and food and heat. There's something wrong with this picture, he said. If we don't find a way to compromise and come together in a bipartisan solution, there'll be something very wrong with this picture. I think we're going to be successful. I saw a lot of opportunity for bipartisan cooperation at that hearing. Senator Portman and I talked about how we're putting aside talking points, listening to all ideas, working in good faith, not wed to only one idea, but looking at ways to solve this. I believe it's not just true of Rob and me. I know of conversations that pretty much every one of you have had with other members of the committee, irrespective of party. The staffs of all 16 members have met for more than 30 hours, as Chairman Hatch said, of briefings by stakeholders and experts. We've met 6 times with 5 public hearings. We know this is complicated. We know it's not easy. It's really 3 related issues. First and most importantly, we all understand the threat to participants and businesses in multi-employer plans that are currently on the path to insolvency. Current law doesn't contain a remedy for the largest of these plans. Second, the looming failure of these plans means the imminent failure of the PBGC. I was briefed yesterday by 7 or 8 PBGC or PBGC affiliated loosely or working with Treasury or Labor or this committee on all that this means with the potential of PBGC on the multi-employer side. PBGC and the multi-employer system made a devil's bargain years ago, trading vastly inadequate premiums for a vastly inadequate benefits guarantee. Now, that bargain threatens to bring down the entire multi-employer system. We've heard over and over in this committee about the $67 billion deficit of PBGC. What that means is the moment one of these large plans fails, it brings down not just that plan, but the entire multi-employer system. Third, finally, these impending crises mean that it isn't enough just to fix the crisis today for these plans. We can't put a Band-Aid over this. We can't just leave the problems with the underlying system to fester and erupt into another crisis 5 years or 10 years down the road. We need prospective changes to make sure we never find ourselves in this situation again. That's the jurisdiction of this committee. These are the 3 issues we have a mandate to solve for the workers like Roberta and the businesses like Spangler Candy and the retirees like Larry. Failing to address all 3 of these issues together would be abandoning the responsibility we have to our constituents and the reason all 16 of us wanted to serve on this committee. Chairman Hatch and I met last week. We're both committed to a solution. We must begin bipartisan meetings with all the members of the committee soon. We're aware of the challenges that lie ahead, but I believe we're going to get there. Too much is at stake for us to retreat back into partisan corners. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator. I want to thank Senators Baldwin and Johnson for being here with us. We appreciate them and their efforts. Our other witnesses this morning are Dr. James Naughton, who is an assistant professor in accounting, information, and management department at the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. Mr. Naughton's research examines the economic consequences of financial reporting practices and how regulatory and technological changes shape a firm's information environment. He has a particular focus on issues related to employee benefits and pensions. Dr. Naughton received his doctorate in business administration from the Harvard Business School, his JD from Harvard Law School, and his BS from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. So he's had quite a good academic background. Prior to graduate school, he was a credentialed actuary at Hewitt Associates, where he worked on the design and administration of employee benefit plans and executive compensation agreements. Next, we have Dr. Joshua Rao. Am I pronouncing that right? Rao, who is a professor of finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a director of research at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Rao has conducted extensive research on the financial structure of pension funds and their sponsors and the measurement of public sector pension liabilities. He specializes in empirical studies of corporate investment and financial structure. Dr. Rao is a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, SIEPR, and a research associate in corporate financing, public economics, and aging at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He received his doctorate in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has a BA in economics from Yale University. We are also joined by Timothy Lynch, a senior director in the government relations and counseling practice of Morgan, Lewis, and Bockius. Mr. Lynch monitors legislative and political trends and developments and specializes in government relations and public policy issues. He has 25 years of management experience in corporate and trade association government affairs. Before joining Morgan Lewis, Mr. Lynch was senior executive and chief lobbyist at the American Trucking Association, where he directed and managed the association's legislative affairs, operations on pensions, labor, and employee benefits, taxes, and a range of other issues. Mr. Lynch also served as president and CEO of the Motor Freight Carriers Association. Mr. Lynch received his MBA and BA degrees from the University of Maryland. Well, we welcome you all to the committee, and
if I could, for a moment, Senator Johnson and Senator Baldwin will introduce Mr. Stribling. Senator
that'd
Johnson.
be fine. Okay, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Hatch, Co-Chairman Brown, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to introduce a fellow Wisconsinite who is here testifying before you today. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Mr. Kenneth Stribling. Kenny is a retired Teamster who was born in Milwaukee and raised in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. After graduating from Sussex Hamilton High School, Kenny began working as a Teamster in 1975. Over the next 35 years, Kenny drove trucks for multiple companies in Wisconsin before retiring in 2010. But of course, Kenny's really not retired. He's actually a rhino, retired in name only, because he currently works part-time as a shuttle driver when he's not advocating for a solution to this challenging problem. Kenny is a dedicated family man and a member of his community. He and his wife Beverly have 5 children and 7 grandchildren, with 2 more on the way. In his free moments away from work and family time, Kenny has mentored young people in his neighborhood. I first met Kenny in 2015 when he came to my office with his concerns about the troubled multi-employer pension system. Kenny's been a leader on this issue since 2015. He co-chairs the Wisconsin Committee to Protect Pensions and received an award for his efforts last November. As co-chair, Kenny has worked tirelessly on behalf of his fellow workers and retirees, commuting to Washington, D.C. often on a weekly basis with a group of dedicated advocates for their cause. We have one of his buddies, Bernie Anderson, here behind me, and Bob Ebston was not able to attend. But I know they commute weekly because we are often on the same flight back to Milwaukee. Before I conclude, I want to emphasize the importance of this committee. I've met with and heard from many of my constituents who are deeply concerned about the dismal state of the multi-employer pension system. Like Kenny, they've traveled around Wisconsin, to Washington, D.C., and recently to Ohio for hearings and meetings to make their concerns known. They are asking for a transparent process and a fair outcome. I sincerely hope this committee can work effectively together to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Baldwin will take any statement you care to make at this point.
Thank you, Chairman Hatch and Co-Chairman Brown and members of the committee. I am also honored to introduce my friend Kenneth Stribling, retired Teamster from Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. In 2015, Kenny received a letter. After working for more than 30 years in the trucking industry, the pension he earned and his family depends on could be cut by 55%. After getting a letter like that, Kenny and other Wisconsin retirees have made countless trips to Washington to make sure that families like theirs receive the full pensions that they have worked for and depend on. Last November, I was proud to stand with Kenny and other Wisconsin retirees that have made countless trips to introduce the Butch Lewis Act. I sincerely hope that this committee considers that legislation in your work to produce a solution to the multi-employer pension crisis that our country is facing. After 3 years, I'm guessing that there are not too many members of Congress that Kenny and the Wisconsin retirees have not met with. Who knows? But I will tell you that as Kenny meets with members of Congress, he's held his personal story a little closer. And I'm grateful to Kenny today for sharing his story with this committee. This committee has been charged with a critical task. This is a complicated issue with high stakes, but not acting is not an option. Not for Kenny or the more than 25,000 workers and retirees in my state with Central States Pension. I thank you for your time this morning, and I especially want to thank the retirees who are in this room who have made many trips to Washington for this cause.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate both of you senators taking time off to be with us. We know that you have other duties to perform, so you can leave at any time and we'll fully understand. Mr. Naughton, we'll turn to you. You'll be the first to testify.
Thank you, and thank you to all the members of the committee for this opportunity. I sincerely hope that my testimony today will help move us towards a solution to this crisis. To begin, I'm going to state what I think is a fairly obvious fact. If multi-employer plans collected actuarially sound contributions and purchased annuity contracts, there wouldn't be a crisis. Participants would be receiving or would be scheduled to receive the annuities that were purchased on their behalf. Instead, multi-employer plans chose to collect contributions that were inadequate, and they made investment decisions that were risky. The reasons trustees pursued such a strategy is pretty simple. Assuming that the overall cost per employee that an employer is willing to pay is fixed, a lower pension contribution means that employees might be able to gain higher non-pension compensation through the collective bargaining process. So, one thing that's important here is that these inadequate contributions and risky investments were a choice. Under the current rules, trustees could just as easily collect reasonable, adequate contributions and follow more conservative investment strategies. So a number of rules were developed in response to the freedom that trustees had with regard to contributions and investments. So most notably, employers who wish to exit a plan have to make additional contributions called withdrawal liability. And all employers agree to be jointly and severally liable for all plan promises, including those for so-called orphan participants. These rules, just to sort of reiterate my earlier point, are not necessary if actuarially sound contributions are collected and invested responsibly. The rules further require that the PBGC, through a separate multi-employer system, step in if employers can't cover underfunded pension promises. and that participants have benefits curtailed further if the PPGC doesn't have the resources in the multi-employer system to cover unfunded benefits to the normal guaranteed amounts. So these rules were developed specifically to address the discretion that the trustees had, and these rules really haven't changed in more than 35 years. Unfortunately, these rules, which were intended to safeguard the system, I believe have instead contributed to its decline. So financially healthy employers avoid multi-employer plans because they are concerned with the possibility of withdrawal liability or the prospect that they have to fund benefits for orphan participants. I personally witnessed this during my career as a consulting actuary. Even when the proposed cost of the multi-employer plan was only a fraction of the cost of a single employer plan, employers typically stayed away from the multi-employer plan. And this was something that was happening 20 years ago. It's not something that just started happening recently. In addition, because the withdrawal liability calculations don't really reflect the actual cost of settling obligations, there was a lot of opportunistic behavior where employers would leave these programs when it was financially advantageous to do so, leaving behind the remaining employers to pick up the shortfall. So the inevitable consequence of inadequate contributions, risky investment choices, and the withdrawal liability provisions is the crisis that we're currently facing. So 10 years ago, when this crisis first manifested, the underfunding on a PBGC basis was about $200 billion. More recently, as Senator Hatch noticed in his opening comments, the system is $638 billion underfunded on the same basis. So you can see that there's been a significant deterioration over the past 10 years, and this has occurred because the plans have continued to pay pensions and make promises without collecting the necessary contributions. My testimony really focuses on providing guidance for prospective changes, and I have 3 specific recommendations. First, the multi-employer plans have to have accurate measurement of liabilities and strong funding rules that eliminate the trustee discretion. That is the source of most of the problems here. When you look at what's done for single employer plans, I would argue that you need to be more conservative with multi-employer plans because there's an interconnectedness with multi-employer plans that make them much more risky. The PBGC should have broad discretion to assume control of plans and implement necessary changes. And there should also be triggering events so that they can step in early to prevent plans from becoming more poorly funded over time. And third, I strongly recommend that we would amend the withdrawal liability provisions. So the goal of those provisions was to essentially collect the value of the benefits that have been promised. And so I'd recommend doing something along those lines, similar to what is done for single employer plans who plan to terminate. Simply require that the exiting company pay for the purchase of annuities from a highly rated insurance company. So in closing, I want to highlight that my suggestions focus on improving rather than replacing the current system. A well-run defined benefit plan is far more effective at assuring retirement security for the types of workers who participate in these plans. I also want to highlight the importance of urgent action. Delays will inevitably lead to larger deficits and choices that will become more difficult. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Rowe?
Thank you, Chairman Hatch, Chairman Brown, members of the committee. Multi-employer pension plans are private economy arrangements between firms and labor unions. Employees earn benefits through their years of work, employers make contributions according to plan rules, and the trustees of the pension plan have a fiduciary responsibility to steward the plan in the interests of the beneficiaries. Something has gone terribly wrong, and I believe much of it can be traced back to the systematic mismeasurement by plans of the costs of delivering on pension promises. If the PBGC is going to guarantee multi-employer pensions, but trustees are not going to naturally operate in a way that ensures the solvency of plans, then Congress must impose strong rules-based requirements that plans measure liabilities according to sound financial principles and remedy underfunding swiftly. Let me illustrate the fundamental measurement problem. Suppose a plan owes an employee an amount of money in 10 years, say $50,000, and suppose the system has just $25,000 in assets today. What actuarial funding ratio will the typical plan report? A funding ratio of just slightly over 100%. You see, if a participating employer had contributed just $25,000 towards this promise, that employer could in many cases withdraw from the multi-employer plan without further obligation, and without the plan having any recourse to that employer if the investment returns do not meet their target. Basing decisions on expected returns while ignoring risk is imprudent, and the fact that the stock market has earned high historical returns does not justify it. Past returns are not a guarantee of future performance, and there's no sense in which just waiting long enough will bail you out. This logic also shows that a loan program is not what is needed. The loan program proposal seems to be based on the idea that if the plans can get a low-interest loan from the government and then invest the proceeds in risky assets and hopefully earn a high return, then the loan can be repaid in full and somehow free money has been created. A loan program would simply be doubling down on these kinds of investment problems. It should have been clear long ago to trustees that minimum funding requirements were insufficient. Trustees had years to take other measures other than trying to force participants to take benefit cuts. Trustees have always had the right to gradually require greater contributions from participating employers, to make more reasonable assumptions about expected returns, and to make more realistic benefit promises on a prospective basis. Despite funding improvement plans, we have not seen much improvement. Plan trustees have done too little until it was too late. So when is a multi-employer plan making sufficient contributions? Well, one standard would be treading water, meaning the unfunded liability isn't getting larger. Another would be actually paying your normal costs plus paying down unfunded liabilities. And under the actuarial measurement standard used by multi-employer plans, most of them are contributing at least enough to pay down this unfunded liability. But I calculate that under much more appropriate solvency standards based on the Treasury yield curve, that the picture looks quite different. Only 1.4% of plans are contributing the cost of new benefits plus a 30-year amortization of unfunded liabilities, and only 17% are treading water. I think a very good comparison point is the single employer defined benefit pension system in the U.S., which is not in great shape, but it's in much better shape than either the multi-employer space or the public plan space. And that's largely a function of the contribution requirements that have existed historically. The legislation surrounding the single employer system has adhered to a key principle. If a plan cannot or does not make required contributions, the sponsor must face an excise tax or terminate the plan. Plans should not get to just promise more benefits with a PBGC and hence potentially taxpayer backstop when they're not prudently funding their existing promises. And as you know, Congress abandoned that basic principle for critical red zone plans in 2006, presumably because it felt that those funding rules were too burdensome, but this just kicks the can down the road. So my written testimony shows that to meet a rigorous funding standard, contributions would have to rise very substantially. Nonetheless, over time, we must approach this standard for all plans. And once phased in, all plans that do not follow funding rules should be subject to an excise tax. And ultimately, if the plan does not meet required contributions, there should be an automatic termination. Furthermore, to address the incentive that this could provide for more employers to withdraw, Congress should immediately act to change the withdrawal liability calculation to also reflect the true value of unfunded liabilities. I'd just like to end by pointing out that Congress should consider carefully the impact on incentives that a loan program or bailout of the multi-employer system would have. And by the way, a loan program is a form of bailout. And by incentives, I mean not only those of multi-employer plans to take risk, but also the moral hazard that bailouts might create for a host of other agents in the economy who might come before Congress to ask for assistance, either because they lost money in their own investments or generally because private parties made flawed arrangements or trustees did not perform their fiduciary duties. And I think first and foremost among them are the state and local pension systems out there who on their own accounts, using discount rates of 7%, have $1.7 trillion of unfunded liabilities, but on a solvency standard, they're actually $4 trillion underfunded. This is the same set of issues that we're seeing in the multi-employer system. And the stronger the belief by the state and local governments that the federal government will bail them out, the less discipline they're going to choose to impose upon themselves for these problems, to address these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Stribling?
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Senator Hatch, Senator Brown, Senator Portman, and other members of the Joint Select Committee for inviting me here today and being so supportive. I'd also like to thank my two senators from the great state of Wisconsin, Senator Johnson and Senator Baldwin, for introducing me. I really appreciate their kind words and their support. They recognize, as you do, that fixing a multi-employer pension plan is a bipartisan issue. Let me tell you my story. I worked for 30 years for 4 different trucking companies that paid into Central State's pension fund. I retired from USF Holland in 2010. My benefits moved with me because my employer paid into the same plan, assuring me that I'd have a secure pension for life. I need this pension income more than ever. I am married and I have 5 adult children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 more on the way. I love my family dearly. And thanks to my pension, I've not been a burden to my family, but instead my wife and me have been able to help out our children, our grandchildren, with child care and support when emergencies happen, and you know they happen. I will never forget the day I received my letter from Central States Pension Fund with the news that they were applying to the Treasury Department to reduce my monthly benefits by 55%. Life changed that day for me. You have no idea what it's like to be retired on fixed income and suddenly be told your monthly check would be cut in half. I was devastated, and so was my family. After receiving this shocking news, I felt I needed to do something. I joined with other retirees to stop the cuts and find a solution. We have been at it ever since. I felt compelled to become involved in this movement to find a solution for the pension crisis. Not only will this solution radically change my retirement years and also affect countless households across the country. This involvement has also changed our lives. I have been through contract negotiations when we have sacrificed wage increases to have better health care and pension benefits. I believe we have done our part in shared sacrifice. In addition to giving up wages, we've often endured tough work conditions, long shifts, cold nights, unheated dock, manual labor. And another day I'll never forget, November 17th, 2017, the day my wife learned she was terminally ill with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, that has spread to her liver. My wife is a fighter and plans to outlive her current diagnosis. Bless her heart. She also is retired after nearly 30 years as a teacher. Fortunately, we have a close, supportive family. Beverly's son and daughter-in-law put their careers on hold, moved back to Milwaukee, spent time with her, and helped me care for her, along with her sister, who also retired and has moved back home and been very supportive. With the help of all our children and extended family, I have been able to continue to remain active in this movement, which includes a lot of travel and meetings. My involvement has taken much of my time and energy, and at times I thought I could not continue. But my wife, again, bless her heart, made me promise to stay committed until a solution was found. I live in a very uncertain future. My wife is dying. I know that. We have mounting health bills, medical bills, and the stress is impacting my health. I was recently diagnosed with an enlarged heart. This is due to high blood pressure and stress. My heart is working overtime just to keep up. My wife is worried that I may end up like Brother Butch Lewis, one of the co-founders of this movement, whose death inspired the legislation named after him. Let me be clear. My story is unique, but I am, like many other retirees, impacted by the possibility of benefit reductions. Life didn't stop when our letters arrived. We also endure life's storms, death, illness, physical and mental health challenges. Now we also have the burden of traveling through our golden years with an uncertain financial future, a future that has been promised to us throughout our working years. I am supporting the Butch Lewis Act, which seems to be the right solution. I'm asking you to think, pray, and do what's right for thousands of faithful, hardworking actives, retirees, and many who have served our country in the military. And also, my wife would have liked to have been here, but she only has a few good days between chemo cycles. However, she is my rock. She's my full supporter, supports with me in my work. And I want you to know how crucial your decision will be for millions of Americans. Her heart is with you and always will be with me. In closing, I want to thank the Joint Select Committee members and agree to find a solution And remember, this is not a bipartisan issue. This is an issue about fairness, keeping promises to working Americans who did everything right and are simply asking you to preserve what is due us now. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you for coming here today. Your testimony is very compelling. We appreciate you taking time to be with us. Mr. Lynch, you're the last one on the panel.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking committee co-chairs, Senators Hatch and Brown, and all the members of the committee for the opportunity to participate in today's hearings. You all volunteered, or at least I hope you all volunteered, for this important assignment, and I applaud your willingness to tackle one of the most important issues of the day, retirement security. My testimony and any answers I provide singularly reflect my own views and not the views of Morgan Lewis or any of its individual clients. My name is Tim Lynch, and I'm the Senior Director of Morgan Lewis's Government Relations Group. Of more relevance to today's hearing, I'm a member of our Multi-Employer Pension Working Group, a group that includes attorneys who have experience counseling both contributing employers and multi-employer pension plans in a wide range of industries, including trucking, construction, bakery, maritime, and supermarkets, both wholesale and retail. We have assisted a number of critical and declining multi-employer plans in navigating the MEPRA process, including Road Carriers Local 707 Fund and the New York State Teamsters Conference Pensions and Retirement Fund, the latter being the largest fund receiving approval from the Treasury and PBGC. It's because of that depth of experience we were asked by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to assist in the preparation of two recent reports, Multi-Employer Pension Crisis, the History, and Businesses and Jobs at Risk. My background is primarily in transportation and trucking. I've been involved in that industry since the enactment of the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, the act that deregulated the trucking industry. The Motor Carrier Act transformed the entire trucking industry. The 1980 MEPA legislation dramatically impacted the unionized portion of the industry. Prior to 1980, 94 of the 100 largest freight hauling companies in the United States had a collective bargaining agreement with the Teamsters under the National Master Freight Agreement. By the mid-1990s, that number was reduced to 6. For certain, some of that reduction was due to consolidation, but the overwhelming majority was as a result of bankruptcy. And since 1980, not a single mid to large-sized trucking company has entered the market with a collective bargaining agreement with the Teamsters to replace all of those other trucking companies who have exited the market. In other words, no new contributing employers to cover an ever-increasing number of beneficiaries. Fast forward to 2014 and the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act. Congress gave plan trustees some powerful tools to address the funding crisis, the ability to adjust benefits, the ability to seek a partitioning of beneficiaries, assistance for facilitation of plan mergers, and financial support. MEPRA was signed into law in December 2014, and plan trustees in critical and declining status immediately had to begin planning for how to utilize the new tools in the toolbox to address the funding crisis. The Treasury website for tracking applications for benefit suspensions identifies the Central States Plan as being the first MEPRA application filed on September 25, 2015. Technically true. However, the first application filed was by Road Carriers 707 on December 14, 2014, the date of enactment of MEPRA. The filing was in the form of a letter, I believe it was 3 sentences long, intended to dramatize the need for Treasury and PBGC to move expeditiously on the process because time was not on the side of the local 707 fund. The fund formally filed on March 15th and eventually was denied, the principal reason being the fund could not demonstrate the proposed actions would allow the fund to avoid insolvency. Unfortunately, the local 707 fund went insolvent in February 2017. Consider this, the very same week in December of 2016 that the notice went out to the plan participants that the fund was going to be terminated, or not terminated, excuse me, was insolvent in February, the fund was also obligated to send out the 13th check because they were not in a position to suspend any of the benefit. The New York State Teamsters Conference Pension and Retirement Fund has a better ending, but the process to obtain approval is nonetheless instructive. The New York Fund withdrew its initial application and refiled. Among the issues that the New York Fund had to deal with was a mortality table, whether it was appropriate for the calculation of benefit modifications. The correspondence was as time-consuming and potentially pushed the fund into a more precarious financial position. These funds had unique circumstances, but one constant, time. A delay, or worse, a denial, simply puts more plans and the benefits of plan beneficiaries at risk. That was the history, but it holds true today. Action is necessary sooner rather than later. The current framework for evaluating the financial status of multi-employer pension plans utilizes 5 categories. As the committee begins to consider a course of action, it might be useful to contemplate what it hopes to accomplish with each of the zones and the plans that are in them. The temptation for green zone plans undoubtedly is simply to leave them alone, and that may very well be the prudent course of action. But you should consider, are there changes that could be made to help ensure that those plans remain healthy. For yellow and orange zone plans, I would suggest the goal should be to provide as many tools as possible and as quickly as possible to the plan trustees. This could include the additional tool of hybrid plans as outlined in the GROW Act legislation. Conversely, the committee should be cautious about adopting procedural changes that, while well-intentioned, could have the adverse impact of pushing these plans into the red zone. For the red zone plans, there is no avoiding the reality that they need a large infusion of cash to remain solvent. Central States achieved a 12.7.4 rate of return in 2017, but it doesn't take a mathematician to calculate the benefit of a 12% return on $15 billion in assets, or $13 billion, or $11 billion, or less. Finally, in my view, the tools given to the plan trustees under MEPR have been underutilized. Only 5 benefit suspension applications have been approved. Only 1 application for petitioning has been approved, and I am aware of no efforts to fully utilize the merger language. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Well, thanks to each of you. You've been very helpful to us here today, and we don't know. It's mind-boggling what approach we're going to need to take, but to the extent that you could help us, you've done a pretty good job. Let me ask you this, Dr. Naughton. I want to thank you for your testimony. You established a compelling case for making systematic improvements to the multi-employer system. And one of the key points that you raise is the trustees and managers of these plans have significant discretion in setting the inputs into the plans and how they measure and manage contributions and liabilities in the plans. You suggest that trustees have chosen to take unique risks in operating the plans. Given that plan trustees are drawn equally from management and labor, what incentives can we look to in order to remove the management risk in the system? If you could help us to understand that, I'd appreciate it.
Excuse me. When you look at the starting point for multi-employer plans, it was something that was that multi-employer plans themselves were actively involved, and so the rules that were eventually developed, the idea, pushed by the multi-employer plans was that they were low risk, and so they should have discretion with the funding rules. They should have discretion with the investments. They should pay a very low and inadequate premium to the PGC. And it really wasn't necessary to have much in the way of guarantees. So when you look at sort of the natural progression of what happened, the trustees themselves, determined the contribution amounts. Senator Hatch is absolutely right. Typically, the trustee board is made up of a combination of employers and union officials. My personal experience was that the union officials tended to dominate those proceedings. They were the majority, they were half the board, and then the employer officials that they typically had were usually people that were quite friendly to the union position. And so in the end, what happened was the trustees sort of got themselves in a cycle where they wanted to promise generous benefits, but they didn't really want to pay for them. And so the hope that they had was that, listen, if we take an inadequate contribution, if we invest it sort of in aggressive securities, maybe we'll get a good return. But if not, we also have the chance that maybe the system will grow, we'll have more participants in the future, and maybe that will help us. And in the end, that type of logic is somewhat flawed when you look just 1 or 2 years into the future. If you look 5 years into the future, it becomes more flawed. And if you look at this from a sustainability standpoint, so 10 or more years into the future, it's incredibly problematic. And what happened in terms of sort of the economic shocks, the specific shocks themselves aren't predictable, but economic shocks are predictable. We know they're going to happen. We just don't know when they're going to happen. And so having a system that sort of relies on being able to collect in the future for past promises is deeply flawed. So, in terms of my testimony, if there's one thing that I would like to see going forward, it's that you just remove that discretion from the trustees. So going forward, if they're going to promise somebody a $100 annuity, they should collect the cost of a $100 annuity, and they should put that money in a trust and then have that be there for the participant to collect on. To have a system where you can make promises and not fund those promises is really not sustainable in the long term. So I truly believe that these plans should continue. They provide valuable retirement security. And we should simply not be in a position where gentlemen like Mr. Stribling are worried about retirement. These plans should have been funded. Well, obviously, we can't go back and correct that, but what we can do is make sure, at least going forward, they are funded appropriately.
Okay, let me just end with this, Dr. Rao. Your written testimony documents that 72% of multi-employer plan participants are in plans that are less than 50% funded, but less than 1% of single-employer plan participants are in plans that are less than 50% funded. Now, that's quite an astonishing difference. What, in your view, explains that difference?
Thank you, Senator Hatch.
Sure.
So the statistic you're citing is that the multi-employer plans are just very, very poorly funded compared to the single-employer plans. Now, I believe that goes back to the overlay of solvency standards in 1987, in the Ober 1987 Act, the overlay of solvency standards for funding on top of the actuarial standards that plans were already using. Congress recognized at the time that it was not adequate to leave so much discretion to the plan trustees of single-employer plans. They did not implement something similar for multi-employer plans, and I believe that the funding differences that we're seeing are really, between the multi-employer and single-employer systems are the result of the fact that there have just been historically much stricter funding standards for the single-employer program, some funding relief in the last 5 or 6 years to that single-employer program notwithstanding.
Okay, thank you. Senator Brown.
Thank you. I want to be clear that no provision exists in current law that can help Central States or the mine workers, period. And if they fail, the PBGC fails. We know that. Mr. Lynch, you stated that sooner or later Congress will have to intervene. I'd like to hear your case for sooner. Why should Congress intervene now as opposed to allowing the plans to fail and then supplying PBGC with tens of billions of dollars it'll need to remain solvent?
These plans are very dependent on investment firms now. The longer the time frame that delays getting them an infusion of cash so that they can restore those revenues makes the problem just that much more difficult to solve. If I could add one, just consider, in 1999, the Central States Fund was virtually 100% funded. I negotiated a labor contract to fund that in 1997 and 98. In 2002, we had obviously what occurred with the market, and in 2003, we had one of the largest truck companies in the United States, Consolidated Freightways, close their doors. No one in 1997 and 98, when we negotiated that contract, foresaw either of those two activities.
Thank you. A quick yes or no, Mr. Lynch. Would a low-interest, long-term loan program with strong guardrails to protect taxpayers be an appropriate way to intervene?
I believe it is the only way that you will save these red zone, critical, and declining plans.
Okay, thank you. There's no doubt, I think for most of them, I can't speak for the rest of the committee, but there's no doubt in my mind that Congress will eventually act to address the problem. The question is whether we are able to come together this year before the crisis inflicts devastating damage on workers, on retirees, on businesses, or whether Congress will put this off until simply put, lives have been ruined and family businesses have gone bankrupt. I want to quote one of our witnesses at the hearing that Senator Portman and I brought to Ohio, the State House. David Gardner, the CEO of Alfred Nichols Bakery and Congressman Regula's hometown of Navarre, Ohio, said, "Because of increasing pension contributions, our business is in jeopardy. Every day we try to figure out ways to cut costs rather than invest in our business and grow our business." It's a over 100-year-old company. Is that, Mr. Lynch, indicative of other employers all over the country that participate in the multi-employer system? And what happens if Congress fails to act this year? What happens to them?
I believe the number in central states is something like 9 out of 10 of the employers in central states are with 50 employees or less. That they will be devastated, in my view, if something is not done sooner or later. As I said in the reference to Local 707, they knew they were going insolvent, they needed help, and every day the clock ticked on them, it made the problem worse, and frankly got to the point where the PBGC was incapable even helping them.
Okay, that's the employer side. Mr. Stribling, tell me what happens. Explain the impact if Congress fails this year to do anything. Tell me about the impact it would have on retirees like you and active members who you know are in the workplace today, but planning for the future with this defined pension benefit.
For me personally, if Congress doesn't act, with what's happening with my personal life, the mounting medical bills, my wife passing away, I'm looking at probably losing my house, going bankrupt, because her medical bills are just enormous. Her medical bills, her drugs, her prescriptions, I just barely can keep up right now. And that, again, I'm not the only one that's having that problem. There's many of us that sit out here in this audience are facing the same crisis. So if Congress doesn't act, I'll be knocking on your door some other way. I'll be asking for some kind of public assistance because I'm going to need it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you, Mr. Stribling, tell me about, I mean, if you're like Teamsters I know in Ohio, you go to meetings, and you, as a retiree, go to meetings in your Teamster Hall in Milwaukee, and you also rub shoulders with active workers, Teamsters. What are they telling you about this?
Basically the same thing, senators and congressmen. It's the same message. It's really hard some days to have meetings, and my phone rings along with Bernie's all day long with people telling sad stories. It's going to be devastating. I just can't make you people understand, well, anyway, I can't make you understand just how serious this really is. We have our meetings monthly, and it's almost the same people coming up asking us, what's going to happen? Can I make a loan? Can I buy a car? Can I buy my home up north? Can I make home improvements? They're all holding off. Nobody wants to make a major purchase. They're afraid. They're afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. We did have a good hearing in Columbus, and we got to hear from workers and retirees and small employers. And for those of you who were there, you know that. For those of you who couldn't come, it was powerful because you heard from not just retirees who are seeing up to a 90% cut in their benefits if we don't do something, but also small businesses that we're talking about the necessity of shutting down. We have about 200 small businesses in Ohio, by the way, associated with central states alone. So it's suppressing wages. And Mr. Lynch, I won't even ask you that question because it is. We'll just stipulate that. It's making it more difficult to hire people at a time when it's tough enough to hire people. Who wants to come and join up with a company that has the kind of potential liabilities that these companies are facing that have stayed in? And in one case, we heard about a company that's paying to the plan about 15 grand a year per active participant, and about half of that's going for those who never worked for the company but are orphan liabilities. And that's just an example of the way the system, I think, is is broken. And I think, you know, Mr. Naughton, Mr. Lynch, Mr. Rao, you would agree with that, that the system itself hasn't worked with regard to how we deal with withdrawal liability and orphans, creating a disincentive for companies to stay in, and has, you know, exacerbated the problem in addition to the other issues we talked about, the demographics, what happened to the market in 2008, 2009. So it was good to hear you all talk a little about the future. Senator Brown talked in his opening about needing to deal with the threat to businesses and beneficiaries, needing to deal with the PBGC, which is at risk of going under, which has this broader contagion effect on the economy, but also on how do we put changes in place. And Representative Schweikert has talked a lot about this too. How do we ensure that we're not just putting a short-term fix in place here, but actually solving the problem? And that's going to require us looking at things like the discount rate, Mr. Rao, you talked about, at least indirectly, looking at withdrawal liability, how we deal with orphans, and so on. Kenny Stribling and I first met in the offices of Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan.
Correct.
And that was in 2016, as I recall.
Something like that. Yep.
And he came in with some other Wisconsin Teamsters to talk to their congressman. It was an important meeting because I think that changed some of the dynamics of this issue and realizing that we're going to have to deal with this issue one way or the other. And it's not easy. There are no simple answers. And as I said at the meeting we had in Columbus, there are lots of different players here, some of whom are actively involved and are going to see devastating results if we don't do something to small businesses, retirees. Others are a big group of taxpayers out there. And, you know, about 98% of taxpayers are not directly impacted as beneficiaries, and yet they're going to be asked to pick up some of the tab here, and I think we have to face that. And a lot of them are people I represent, we all represent, who may have a 401k that's underfunded. Almost half of them don't have a pension or a defined contribution plan at all. And so, you know, we're all trying to help on the retirement system in other ways, and we should. But this is not an easy issue to resolve. We have to acknowledge that at the outset. On the other hand, not dealing with it has tremendous impacts on individuals like Mr. Stribling, but also on the entire economy, I would argue. Those small businesses are going to go bankrupt, and the contagion effect on other businesses. Mr. Naughton, you talked a lot about the liabilities, and you said that the aggregate underfunding has more than tripled since 2006 when we passed the Pension Protection Act. I was a conferee on that. No one would have thought at the time, would they? You know, we thought we'd put in place some things that would help to maintain the multi-employer pension plans and the single employer. You talked about the issues, including the discount rate. Let me ask you a question. If the discount rate were changed for critical and declining status plans like Central State, in addition to the green zone plans, what would happen to those that are in critical and declining status? And wouldn't that risk putting contributing employers out of business altogether and therefore increasing the risk to other multi-employer plans?
Thank you, Senator Portman. So I think, you know, just to back up a little bit, if you look at what's being promised, it's a very valuable benefit, right? So to promise somebody an annuity that they're going to collect for the rest of their life once they hit a certain age, that's a valuable thing to provide. And the problem here is that the funds weren't set aside for that, okay? If you now all of a sudden step in and say, well, listen, we need to all of a sudden sort of fund everything, it's simply not possible based on the resources that employers have. So if you look at the way this system is set up, it goes from you know, the money in the plan. Then, to the extent that's not enough, you hit the employers up. And to the extent that's not sufficient, then you hit the PBGC up. And to the extent they don't have the money, then the participants themselves have to absorb significant cuts in their benefits. So that's the way that the system is set up. And where we are now is, you know, to the extent that we all of a sudden change the funding requirements, it would be debilitating to the employers that are currently contributing. They're already contributing, as you mentioned, significant amounts more than perhaps is sort of the benefits that their employees are actually earning. But the system that they agreed to join is not one where they just fund their own employees. So back when I was, a consulting actuary, and we discussed with employers, okay, you have a union workforce. Do you want to have your own plan, or do you want to be part of the multi-employer plan? It was almost always the case that the multi-employer plan was less expensive, and sometimes dramatically so.
Yeah. Let me just interrupt you for a second. And we appreciate your expert testimony and your background and experience, but you're talking about what happened in the past. You're talking about how I got into the problem. You're talking about the fact that it was sort of a moral hazard here, and companies chose to go into multi-employer because it seemed like it was a better deal for them. And that's part of the reason we're in the situation we're in with multi-employers vis-a-vis, as Dr. Rao said, the single-employer plans. Multi-employers were not as well funded. My question to you is about what do we do now? What do we do now? And understanding, as Senator Brown has said, we got to look forward and say, we've got to be sure the discount rate works. We got to be more conservative probably in our estimates. But what would you do now for those critical and declining plans to ensure that they don't go belly up and we don't have an even larger problem on our hands with regard to the impact on the broader economy?
Fair enough. So if we just focus on the critical and declining plans, what we can say is that they've promised benefits that are far exceed the resources that they have available to them. And so what it comes down to, it is on.
A little closer to the microphone.
And so, so what it comes down to is who's going to pick up the difference. So that's not my level. That's not really my expertise, right? So my expertise is saying, going forward, if we fix the funding rules, at least this problem will not get worse. As you noted in your earlier question, it's gotten worse over the past 10 years. And the reason for that is even over those 10 years, we still haven't required that contributions line up with what's been promised. And so every day there's another promise made, and every day there's a contribution that doesn't meet that promise collected.
Well, my time has expired. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. We will come back to this, but again, I agree with you in terms of going forward.
Yep.
But our issue is what do we do now to avoid the problem getting worse? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Representative Neal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists. Senator Portman and Senator Brown would confirm I've worked on retirement issues in the House for much of my career and spent a lot of time on these various issues, and Mr. Lynch would suggest as well, because he's known me for a long time. And I want to ask you a couple of questions, Mr. Naughton, based on the testimony you offered. You left out the recession and what that did to the retirement plans. Do you wish to comment on that?
Sure, comment on it. So when you look at economic events, they're predictable. And I think the root cause of why we're in the position we're in is not, consolidations, it's not recessions, it's really the mismanagement of the plans.
Did you find any CDOs were used during the challenges, or was there any employer that took the retirement plan and went to Las Vegas? Did you find that?
Can I give you, so let me give you an analogy. So this is something that I got from my father. So imagine there's a guy in the ocean, and he's swimming away, and all of a sudden the ocean goes out, tide goes out, and it turns out he's naked. That's a problem. He shouldn't be out there. And the question is he naked because the tide went out, or is he naked because he chose to be naked? And when you look at things like what happened here, the trustees made the choice. The stuff that happened with consolidations, the stuff that happened with the recession, with returns, with investments, those are all the tide going out.
But what I'm trying to get at here is that you don't find really malfeasance, and what worked 4 decades ago might not work quite as well today.
No, I disagree with that.
But part of the argument that Mr. Stribling has offered here today is that in good faith he did what he was supposed to do. And I'm suggesting to the panelists perhaps that I wasn't here to create the S&L problem, but I watched the federal government resolve it.
Yep.
I was here for the Wall Street fiasco, not having been a participant in those decisions, but we were asked to solve it. And I think when you hear testimony as we did today and yesterday, and a very good get-together in Columbus, Ohio just a couple of weeks ago, we're reminded that the rearview mirror might be helpful in an academic setting to provide a correction going forward, But the problem we have is immediate, and it's right in front of us, and if we don't act, the PBGC has all sorts of problems going forward as well. So, Mr. Lynch.
One item just before. So I completely agree with your position that the participants did not know what was going on. That's not what I'm arguing here. What I'm arguing is the trustees knew.
Okay.
So the trustees were the ones that made the promises, and what I would argue is they knew, and that's not just based on a look back, that's based on my actual experience 20 years ago, negotiating with employers and trustees at that time.
But you agree something has to be done?
Oh, for sure.
Okay, that's the point that I'm trying.
Yes,
thank you, and I thank you for that part of the testimony. And Mr. Lynch, I've known you for a long time. Are you supportive of the concept? Because it's the legislation that I've put forward that at the moment seems to be the marker, the loan.
As I've said, both in the written and in the answer earlier, there is no way to save these critical and declining plans without some infusion of cash. If that's a loan program, some other variation of that, but there is no way to save those plans without it.
Mr. Stribling, did you use any derivatives in your retirement plan?
Me personally?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
Did you? How about CDOs? Did you use any collateralized debt obligations?
No, I did not.
No, you didn't. You
not.
didn't take a journey to Vegas to double your pension?
I've only been to Vegas one time, and that was about 2 years ago.
All right. So the point I'm trying to make is that the people that are being harmed by this didn't do anything wrong.
No.
And nobody here has suggested fraud. Nobody has suggested across-the-board malfeasance. And I think that in the case of the retirees that are here and have offered sufficient testimony, and I want to say from Columbus, I want to congratulate Senator Brown and Senator Portman. Those witnesses in Columbus, including the employers, were outstanding. The employers pointed out they did everything they were supposed to do along the way, and the retirees, they said they had done everything they were supposed to do along the way, and they met the obligations that they were supposed to. So again, I'm delighted with the witnesses here, but the point is that the rearview mirror can be helpful in a classroom, which I've spent much of my life, but it's not so helpful going forward. And how do we do something before the end of the year with some recommendations so that we can get this back up and running? And people like Mr. Stribling are not taking 50% cuts in their pensions? Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Is Senator Manchin here? Joe, you're next. You're next, Joe.
Thank you, and thank all of you all. And I think most of you know I come from West Virginia, a little wonderful little coal mining state and extraction state, heavy lifting state, heavy working state, and a lot of people that have given everything to this country. They never thought at one time when in 1946, the Krug-Lewis Act at that time was saying that for every ton of coal to be mined, that there would be money set aside from that ton of coal that would pay care of their pensions and retirement because of the difficult jobs they were doing and the need of this country to have the energy. They did everything they could do to. Average pension in miners is about less than $600, and most of that's going to widows because their spouses have paid the ultimate price. So we're not dealing with $2,000, $3,000 pensions at all. We're dealing with survivability. We were asking, you know, we passed a bill called the Miners Protection Act. We passed half of it. And I was asking my colleagues and my friends on the Republican side, you know, at that time, please, let's pass this entire bill because we had a fix. We were using AML, abandoned mine land monies, that we had excess that would have taken care of the cash infusion. We'd have been in good shape. And we'd have not been here. We'd have been helping our friends in Malta State and Central State. But we're in this now. We're the first ones to go down the tube. If ours breaks, we have basically one major employer paying 80% of the cash flow coming into the system now. That person has one hiccup or something happens along the way. We're in severe problems and we go down much quicker. And then the whole thing starts to unravel. So you all have just said, and I think Mr. Lynch, and I would think that Mr. Naughton and Mr. Ryle, and I know Mr. Stribling, you're the end result here. You're the face of what we're dealing with, and we have all of our miners and their families back here. But none of you disagree. I don't think, Mr. Ryle, I haven't even heard you. You understand we have to have some fix. It's going to take an infusion of cash. I think all of you have agreed to that. We could have fixed ours before, but we can't now. So now we're going to need an infusion with the mine workers for basically a fix. So you're all in that position, right? It takes some sort of a fix. It can't be fixed on its own without an infusion of cash.
An infusion of cash from where?
I'm just saying a fusion of a loan. How do you think it can be fixed without a loan?
So, listen, as has been said thus far, there is little that can save plans that are insolvent. And I just want to, I'd like to express actually great admiration for you, Mr. Stribling, and for a life of very hard work. And the American economic system is founded on the idea that factors of production, capital, and labor will be compensated when they contribute to the process of production. And it's clear you've personally contributed a tremendous amount, and that the promises that have been made to you are in danger of not being kept. I think the question is, what is the role of the federal government when agreements between employers and trade unions go wrong and people like Mr. Stribling are hurt? Is it to provide loans which are going to be tantamount to bailouts of the plan? Or is it primarily to ensure that the responsible parties are held liable for their contractual obligations? I think employers enter these agreements, these arrangements, they are responsible, and so I think as a first pass we should be tightening the withdrawal liability rules.
Mr. Rao, I'm sorry, I only have so much time, you're taking all my time. With that being said, I can tell right now you and I are in a complete different universe, okay? Completely different. And with that being said, there's a responsibility. We've got real people, real people's lives, families involved right now. And as I think my good friend, Congressman Neal said, didn't hesitate. Didn't hesitate on the banks, didn't hesitate on the auto, didn't hesitate on anything else when there was large corporate stockholders involved, all the different things that basically happened. We come to the aid immediately overnight. I wasn't here. I understood you worked in the 24-hour turnaround on some of this. All we're asking for is, if they'd have done what we asked for with the mine workers, AML money, we'd have been out of this. We're not. We can't fix it now unless we have some assistance.
I believe you should have hesitated on those corporate interests, by the way.
Should have hesitated?
To bail out those corporate interests.
I wish you'd have come and testified at that time. I didn't hear you speaking up then.
If I had been invited, I would have gladly done so.
Yeah, you can always come. It's an open space.
Feel free.
What we're looking for is solutions right now. And I'm just saying that we've been talking here for, what, 6 months? We were created when? And we're talking in November. We haven't gotten any closer. So we're going to have to come to agreement somehow. Is there some infusion of money? Some sacrifices have been made. I don't know how much of a sacrifice that anybody can, I think, consciously ask a miner to say, okay, you're making $582. Can you give us something back? That's ridiculous. So you're asking for sacrifices on that side, and we're not asking for anything other than basically stepping forward and getting this done. The quicker we get this done, the better we are. Every month goes by, every year goes by, we're in trouble. So I'm asking my friends, sooner or later, we've got to have a bipartisan discussion, just us only, us sitting in a room.
We will. Let's get all the facts.
I know that. And I'm asking for that as soon as we possibly can, to find out what we can agree on that we think is reasonable, that we can move forward on. Because we're coming down to where we're going to have to make a decision. We're going to run out of time and say, well, I'm sorry, we have no solution.
Senator, time is up, Senator Scott.
Yeah, I know. I figured that would happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
That's you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this select committee, this is the 5th committee hearing, and it's focused on how multi-employer pension systems affects various stakeholders. I appreciate all of our witnesses' testimony and believe they raise worthwhile points for us to consider. In the weeks ahead, I look forward to the bipartisan meetings we're going to have and good faith negotiations on how to address this looming crisis. As we proceed, we have to keep in mind what Mr. Stribling told us today about the fundamental fairness and keeping promises to working Americans front and center, and how we have to keep in mind what the workers and retirees and businesses told us in Ohio 2 weeks ago. We have to keep what our constituents are telling us every day. Through no fault of their own, hardworking Americans are at risk of losing nearly everything they worked for and sacrificed for over their lifetimes. Let me ask Mr. Lynch a question. Mr. Lynch, can you tell us what problems the federal government budget will incur if we don't do anything at all?
Congressman, I wish I had the expertise to give you an answer to that. I mean, I have to think it's pretty severe. I mean, let's just play this out. At some point, if Senator Manchin's, if the mine workers and the Central States funds end up at the PBGC's doorstep, they don't have the resources to pay that. They're insolvent. At that point, I think the Congress will have a very, very more difficult decision then than they do today. As difficult as the decision is today.
The PBGC received premiums with a promise to pay minimum benefits if the plans went broke. If the fund, PBGC, runs out of money, do they not still have a moral obligation? Does not the federal government have a moral obligation to make good on its promise?
I'll be glad to do it.
Personally, I would say yes, but
Okay, well, they took the premiums, they made the promise. The federal government took the premiums and made the promise.
and the PBGC is a federal agency.
Okay. If some of the plans that are presently in jeopardy go broke, what effect could that have on other plans that are presently not in jeopardy?
The system is very interconnected. I mean, you have large employers, well, small employers as well, but you have large employers that are typically contributing into 10, 25, 30 different plans in the same industry. I mean, that's typical in the trucking industry. So if one of those plans goes insolvent, that is, and if there's something that triggers a withdrawal by one of those contributing employers, that will have the contagion effect and the ripple effect throughout the system.
Thank you. Mr. Norton, what problem occurs if we delay action?
I'll go right to you.
So every day,
Does the problem get easier or harder?
every day, the system becomes more underfunded in its current form. So, and it depends sort of, you know, if you look at it from the government standpoint, you know, the PBGC is a separate agency. It does cover the benefits, and to the extent that the premium or the funds they have are insufficient, then the benefits get reduced. That's sort of how things are set up right now. So when you look at the decisions that would have to be made, they'll become harder because there'll be more people that would have to take larger benefit cuts. And, you know, once the PBGC is involved in making those cuts, there's no issues of fairness, right? They just sort of go down the line and cut everybody's benefits. So it's a very difficult sort of situation to be in.
But the situation gets better or worse if we delay?
It gets much worse.
And why does it get worse?
It's more money. You know, again, every day the unfunded obligations go up because every day contributions are being collected that are insufficient relative to the promised benefits. And every day there's funds that are paying out pensions that they do not have the resources to be paying. And so as you delay, those things are just going to grow over time. So if you look at in the last 10 years, the $438 billion increase in underfunding was somewhat predictable. You know, and that's just going to continue to grow into the future.
Now, several members have mentioned the fact that there are fewer businesses involved. If these plans were really solvent by normal definitions of solvency, should that make any difference at all?
Absolutely not. If you have a system that relies on getting more employers to join or getting new employees, it's just an indication that you're not solvent. So solvency means I can pay what I owe. If my credit card bill comes in the mail and I can pay the full balance, I'm solvent. If I can only make the minimum payment, I'm not. It's as simple as that.
And are you aware of what the U.S. Code, how the U.S. Code defines solvency of these plans?
From the actuarial standpoint or from a corporate standpoint?
From the statutory standpoint, where it says that it's insolvent if it can't make payments today.
Yeah, so if you look at ERISA, the way it's defined is a little bit counterintuitive. And it basically says you become insolvent when you literally have no money left to pay benefits, which is different, right? Because if I promise you $100,000 a year from now, and that's a promise, I have to pay you, and I literally have no money today, any reasonable person would say you're insolvent.
Today?
Today. But what the ERISA code does is it says you're insolvent a year from now when you actually have to make that payment. And that's not.
And that allows us to get in the mess we're in today, and that is a fault of the federal government for allowing that to happen, isn't it?
You know, I personally think that if I were a trustee of one of these plans and I knew I had these payments, that I would collect the payments. And if you look at plans, obviously I talk in averages. On average, the trustee didn't collect sufficient contributions. Doesn't mean they all didn't. It just means on average they didn't. And so the question is, who's at fault? Is it the trustee for not collecting the contribution, which the rules allowed, or is it the government for giving that trustee the discretion to not collect the contribution?
Well, I think that second one puts us on the hook. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Manchin desires 2 extra minutes.
I just very
And I'll
briefly.
turn to Senator Hyde.
Thank you very much. And I meant to, first of all, introduce this letter from President of the United Mine Workers, Cecil Roberts, and it concerns their concerns and also the history of how we are, where we are with the UMWA. And I had one question I just wanted to follow up on. I talked about briefly the Mine Workers Retirement Fund dating back to the White House 1946. In fact, the Coal Commission, led by then Republican Secretary of Labor Elizabeth Dole, found that UMWA fund, in as much a creature of government as the collective bargaining, there's a line running from the original Boone Report to the present system. In a way, the original Krug-Lewis agreement predisposed, if not predetermined, the system that evolved. When we secured an agreement to ensure the health care of 22,600 miners last year, we made sure that everyone knew we were not done and we had to have a pension fix. So I would ask both Mr. Naughton and Mr. Rao, are you familiar with the Krug-Lewis agreement, and do you know of any other industry-wide multi-employer health pension fund agreement between the private sector and the government that guaranteed pension benefits for life? Just a yes or no if you knew about that or understood the government had any type of an arrangement like that.
On the pension side, no, I'm not familiar with any particular arrangement like that.
And likewise, not familiar.
Yeah. Well, the reason why there isn't another one like it, that's why we are so different, and that's why I want to make sure that got into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Let's go to Senator Heitkamp now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member for holding a hearing. I'd like to start by making an observation. Today's hearing is entitled, How the Multi-Employer System Affects Stakeholders. So I'd like to know, Mr. Naughton, will your pension be cut if we don't solve this problem?
I don't have a pension.
Yeah. But you don't have any personal stake in resolution of this problem beyond being a shareholder or a taxpayer.
You are correct. So
Okay.
my
Mr. Rao, do you have any stake in resolution of this beyond being a taxpayer?
Not beyond being a taxpayer,
Yeah.
no. But it's an
Mr.
important
Lynch?
one.
I do not.
But you're all sitting in chairs that were supposed to be reserved for stakeholders. And so I'm going to turn my attention to Mr. Stribling. You've worked a lot of years. You gave up wages in exchange for economic security, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Yep. You were willing to work long hours. In fact, you've told us what a demanding job you had, and 4 different employers, I think you said. And you did that because you thought you could retire with some dignity, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and as a participant in the plan, did you ever make decisions about the operation of the plan? Were you sitting at the table trying to decide what the investment should be? Did you make a decision on where the premiums or the benefits were going to be resolved?
No, I did not.
Okay, good. So sadly, your story's not unique. Thousands of retirees are confronting similar circumstances. One of my constituents, who lives in Riverdale, North Dakota, named George Ganji, wrote in to tell me that he worked for SuperValue for 35 years, and the majority of his working hours were in the middle of the night. He was unable to attend his school, his children's school program. He worked hard, and now he's been told that his pension will have to be cut. You know, he doesn't think that's fair. And I think that is what this hearing is about the empathy and equities that we should be discussing about the shareholders or the stakeholders. And so this possibility's caused him many sleepless nights and obviously is having taken a toll on his health. With these in mind, I'd like to ask the witnesses here today, the academics who are here, whether they believe that folks like Mr. Ganji and Stribling should have to take a cut. Is that the solution here, that they should have to have their pensions cut? And we'll start with you, Mr. Nunn.
The agreement is between
No, I mean, is the only way that you see to resolve this is to cut the pensions of the people sitting at this table and behind you.
There's only so much money to go around. So the employers do not have the funds, the unions do not have the funds. That leaves either participants or taxpayers. And so the question is, should taxpayers bear any cost? Yeah, they should. Of course they should. I think it's totally inappropriate that somebody closes in on retirement.
So your answer is maybe.
Yeah.
Mr. Rao, do you think that the only way out of this is for these stakeholders here, these pensioners, to take a cut?
You know, it's not my decision to make, but if you decide that you want to avoid benefit cuts, then my recommendation would be to try doing that through supporting the PBGC as opposed to a loan program. It's not my decision to make, and there are only...
But you've recommended no federal intervention.
I recommend no loan program, and in general, I think you have to answer the question as to when agreements between employers and trade unions go wrong and people like Mr. Stribling are hurt, what should the federal government do?
Well, you've answered the question for us. You've said nothing. The federal government should do nothing.
They should certainly not do a loan program. They should consider whether supporting the PBGC financially would be a viable way to go if you believe that the guarantee levels of the PBGC are too low and that it's underfunded.
I only have a few minutes left, so after today's hearing, my office will be holding a Facebook Live event for people who have been involved and impacted by the collapse of our multi-pension system so they can tell their stories for the record. I invite all members of this committee and the attendees in the audience to stop by Dirksen 534 and share your story for the record on Facebook. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Norcross, you're next.
Thank you, first of all, to the chairs and to the 16 members of the committee who we've been dealing with this issue for a number of months, but in particular for the efforts that I know most of you feel. And certainly thank you to the panelists. We very much appreciate you coming by today. But the realities that we're facing are daunting. It's not if, but when. The threats are so real. First of all, to those retirees, wages that were earned but deferred, or as I called, dreams deferred for your golden years. And quite frankly, to the employers, because so many of the employers that we're talking about, not the ones who've gone into bankruptcy, but the ones who continue today to employ people who are those future retirees, who face the very real reality that they will go bankrupt. They will go out of business, adding to this problem. And quite frankly, the threat to America, the loss of confidence in the retirement system. The average person doesn't know the difference between a 401, 402, multi-employer pension. All they are going to hear is that a retirement system is collapsing. Something that we inherently as Americans trust is being ripped away from them. And what's the difference between trusting that and trusting Social Security? The loss of confidence to our country in its retirement system and its ability to have those dreams, those golden years, is literally at stake here. You know, we're the greatest country on earth. We're viewed that way by the world, not by the way we treat those that have the most, but the way we treat those who have the least, who are in trouble. And in some of the testimony that we've heard, I would question, why do we ever help anybody who's been in a hurricane? Hey, you're in Texas, you're in Florida. You should have known that's a hurricane area. You should have lifted your house 10 feet off the ground. But we're a caring nation. We come to those who, through no fault of their own, have been devastated. But using some of the logic I hear today, you should have moved after that last hurricane. Do you know what we do in America? Do you know what we do here in Congress? We come together to help those people because we are a great nation that understands this. I hate to believe that if I went overboard and, God forbid, I didn't have my life jacket on, sorry, we're not going to save you. You don't have a life jacket on. You should have known. No, that's not America. So when I hear some of these things, and by the way, there are some great stories. The majority of multi-employer plans are in the green zone. And some of the questions that I want to bring up is, you as a trustee, understand you get these figures each and every day. Equally between management and labor, there is no majority. You suggest that somehow the unions had control. This is about retirees. This is not about a union issue. This is about literally the collapse of our system when people go and try to cash in, and those companies now are drugged down by those unfunded liabilities. Mr. Norton, you're a trustee. Put yourself in that position. You're seeing the numbers. You're in a, let's pick a number out, 200 company multi-employer plan. How do you account? How do you see bankruptcy by other companies coming when you're making that contribution? How would you know company number 249 is going to go bankrupt and leave you that unfunded liability?
So again, the only reason they're leaving an unfunded liability behind is because
How do you know as a trustee?
I don't need to know. If I collect the right...
You don't need to know, so
I don't
hold
care.
it. Then let me ask you this question. Since you don't need to know, and you have to fund that system, that's going to increase the amount of money your company has to put in, isn't it? Isn't it?
So
if somebody goes bankrupt and they leave that unfunded liability to the last man standing, correct? Why don't you need to know that? Doesn't it impact what you have to contribute?
Just to clarify, so you're putting me in the position of the trustee. So
which you were saying it was their fault.
Yeah,
that they should have seen it. So how would you know what to contribute for a potential bankruptcy by an unrelated company to you other than being in the system? How would you know that?
So, again...
Would you know it?
I don't,
yes or no?
Yeah, I understand. I don't need to know. If I collect the right contributions, I don't care.
You don't need to know, even though it would impact your premium that you would have to pay.
It doesn't impact it. If I collect the right amounts, it doesn't impact
Whoa, stop. What do you mean it doesn't? You're absolutely factually incorrect. So the unfunded liability comes over to the remaining companies, last man standing, correct? So and you're part of the group that is left. That would change.
So you're talking about a plan today where I'm already in a position where I have massive obligations.
No, I'm not saying that. Didn't bring that up at all.
Okay, if I'm in a plan that I'm setting up today and I collect.
No, you're in the midst of a plan.
It's one of
I'm running over. Obviously,
I apologize.
We'll get back to it in maybe the second round. Okay. Think about your answer.
Thank you to both of our chairmen. And I am going to express my concern, as some others have, that this is our 5th hearing. I think we have 19 work days, or the House members. I don't know what the Senate's going to be doing work-wise, but all of us together. And for me, failure's not an option. I think failure should not be an option for any of us on this committee. And I hope we are going to get together. This hearing is to hear from the stakeholders, but I have been hearing from the stakeholders every single day. And I have stories of, some of the members have heard me talk about this. A man came to me during the district work period and said he wanted to put a gun to his head. He didn't want to live because he didn't know what his options were. The desperation of family after family, I see them every weekend. They come to my front door at home, and now they're coming and talking to me from across the country because they think I'll listen, and I will. I'll never turn anybody away. So I get pretty mad today, Mr. Naughton, when you make it sound like, whether you meant it to sound like this or not, you made it sound like the employees were somehow to blame or that people weren't collecting enough. There were a lot of assumptions made on pensions. I think one of the things that we have to study in this committee is how do we strengthen pension laws. I remember, many of my colleagues talk about previous bailouts. There were Republicans and Democrats that didn't want to bail out the auto industry, but if the auto industry had not gotten support and loans that were paid back, the entire economy of these United States would have collapsed. And that was why people who didn't even want to ever do something like that did. And we are talking about what will happen to the economy, what will happen to communities, and what will happen to human beings across this country if we don't address this problem. Because of this, I want to just ask Mr. Stribling questions first so we can be very clear for everybody in this room. Senator Hodekamp started down this way. But have you made any investment decisions for the plan in which you participate?
Absolutely not.
Did you make any of the decisions about the amount of contributions that employers make or negotiate any withdrawal liability from employers leaving the plan?
Absolutely not.
As a multi-employer pension plan participant, are you simply informed of these decisions by the trustees of the fund?
No, I am not.
You're not even informed.
I'm not informed.
So is there anything you could do as a participant in a multi-employer plan to write the course of your pension plan?
No, there is not.
Is it correct to say the current state of these plans is not your fault?
Absolutely.
When your union negotiated on your behalf, is it your understanding that you said, and we talked about this, but I don't think people understand. How many people do you know gave up pay raises, sacrificed compensation increases at the time because of the promise of a safe and secure retirement? Did you?
Yes, I did.
And do many of your colleagues do the same thing?
Absolutely.
So when we have testimony in this room that makes it in a very callous way sound like people had something to do and it's people's, the people that are being impacted by this across the country, by the way, it's not, some of us have states that are more impacted than others. We have to, what is our human responsibility to people across the country? Mr. Lynch, I want to come back to you. If I pick up one theme in your testimony, it's simply that Congress must act now. You stated that action's necessary sooner rather than later. Why do you believe that to be true? And do you believe that the cost of a solution will only go up if the committee fails to act, and what the cost is if we don't act?
The cost will absolutely go up. There's no, at least in my mind, there's just no question about that. You have an opportunity now, if you can get yourselves to a position where there's an agreement on some kind of infusion of cash. You have a plan like Central States that can then use those funds, pay back the loan, but they can use those funds in order to generate the investment income that keeps them alive and not go into insolvency.
Mr. Chairman, I'm almost out of time, so I'm simply going to state again, failure is not an option. We have a moral responsibility to act for the people of this country.
Ms. Dingell, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I wanted to just let people know, and Congresswoman Dingell has talked about this, so have others, about the urgency of this. The Chairman Hatch and I met last week. We are asking, because of the House schedule and the Senate, and we're going to be, I think the Senate's going to be in session 2 or maybe 3 weeks in August. You will not be. I guess you guys are out next week. We're here then and then in August. But we have empowered our staffs, deputized our staffs to get serious about negotiations. The leadership staff of the committee, but also rank and file member staff. And then Chairman Hatch and I will reconvene in September, a bipartisan member meeting, and we hope to get close to real solutions in September as we move into the fall when we know elections come and members are all over the place. So that's important.
I think that summarizes it pretty good. We still have Congressman Schweikert and then Senator Smith.
Could I say to both co-chairs before we go on, I will fly any place, anytime, and be a member of this committee. You can count on morning, noon, and night between now and November. I don't care about elections.
I know you well enough to know you will.
Yeah, I know you very well, and I know you'll do it.
Mr. Chairman, I think there are other members of the committee that would be willing to come back.
That's right.
Including myself.
We would. Well, I mean, I don't want to speak for the Republicans, but we would come back to work with the Senate if we could get together, because I think it matters.
We're going to solve this problem, so we'll have
I trust you. I know you. You're right. We've known each other a long time.
We're going to solve it. It isn't going to be easy, and it's probably not going to please anybody, but we're going to solve it. And let's go to Representative Schweikert, and then we have Senator Smith will be the last.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to be harmonious with my brothers and sisters here in the committee and so many of the people we've met with. But I must tell you, being someone who's tried to read everything, it's the joy of having a 5-hour flight to get home. I've grown to believe that we almost need to consider a revolution of redesign, that the current model, the current statutes in the multi-employer functionally don't work. Even if we patch things up, there's going to be another wave. And I think we need to be honest, because there is a cascade effect in our society as we're getting older very fast. Our birth rates have collapsed. This is what the future looks like. Today it's multi-employer. I mean, if we're having an intellectually honest conversation about underfunding, can we now talk about Social Security and Medicare? Can we now talk about so many other things? At some point, we need to be intellectually credible here of what's going on in our society. Is it Stribling? Stribling. You think I would get just a quick conversation. When you're at the union hall and you're talking with some of the younger workers, do you think are they prepared to pay higher amounts into the pension system right now, partially to, shall we say, deal with the unfunded liabilities of their brothers and sisters who are moving into retirement or in retirement?
I would honestly say yes.
Good. That's actually, because that may be what society is heading towards right now. For my two actuaries here, trying to say, if I wanted to actually fix this permanently, and we open up the playbook, do we take those who are not in receiving benefits and start to build a different model? Do you do what Boeing did years ago? Take those and create a defined contribution, or, as you've written about, almost a methodology of a built annuity system? What would create permanent stability for the future? Because when our net present value calculations are so radically different between individual plans and these multi-employer plans, we're always going to see a systematic underfunding because it benefits that current negotiation but underfunds the future. What would you do?
Either approach is fine. So if you go to a defined contribution plan, it takes care of the funding issue. If you go to the model I suggest...
Could you do me a favor? You have the problem with height. You're farther away from the mic, so lean into it.
I'll lift it up. Okay. So whether it's a defined contribution plan or whether it's a plan that sort of dictates that the contributions are actuarially sound, an annuity type model, what you're doing is you're sort of fixing in place something that will ensure that the money will be there. Okay, so the funding issues go away with both approaches. An annuity type model is, in most cases, better because it pools risk better. With defined contribution, sometimes individual participants invest poorly. Sometimes individual participants outlive their assets. Sometimes they sort of died before retirement and then the assets weren't really needed in the first place. And so when you look at sort of pooling all of the risks...
So pooled annuity model with sort of layered entry and
Correct.
Then the blended benefit of mortality table.
Correct. And that sort of is so from an economic efficiency standpoint, it ensures that everything is geared towards retirement security.
Doctor.
The multi-employer trustees have not acted in the interests of the beneficiaries as they should have. And furthermore, if the PBGC backstops them and if taxpayers are partially backing the PBGC, then to have any kind of defined benefit system, the rules must be very, very tight. And I wonder whether Congress has the desire to make them tight enough. And so that's why I believe that Congress should be requiring systems that are not paying contributions to stop making new promises, meaning to freeze these plans. Frozen plans themselves should be required to stabilize their funding levels.
That's a similar model we right now use with individual employer models, where it has to be a credible rate of return, because you just all saw that CalPERS and those are recalculating for the future of a lower rate of return in the coming years. But also, if they're not meeting the actuarial soundness, they must shut the plan down.
That's right. As you mentioned CalPERS, the other thing that CalPERS does, by the way, on this withdrawal liability point is that if a public agency, local government wants to withdraw from CalPERS, CalPERS charges them a rate based on the terminated annuity pool, which is a rate of around 3%. So they have a rule in place where the withdrawal liability must be calculated, the equivalent of the withdrawal liability must be calculated using rates that reflect the fact that these are promised benefits.
Mr. Chairman, I know we're up against time.
We have one last questioner.
But I believe actually we need to be prepared to do a long list of improvements and changes so we're never in this room again. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Smith, you're the last one.
Thank you, Chair Hatch, and thank you, Ranking Member Senator Brown, for your leadership on this issue. And here's what I am taking away from this. We start out with the idea that there really are no provisions in law that are going to help this situation. Senator Brown made that point in the very beginning. There maybe is one place where we have consensus here is that the longer we wait to solve this problem, the worse it gets, the more expensive it gets, so we might not, our panelists don't all agree on what the solution ought to be. I appreciate Senator Portman making this point. Mr. Stribling, you point out that all policy is personal. One way or another, it affects people in personal ways, and so I want to thank you for being here and drawing our attention to the personal impact of inaction in this situation. And I know that behind you are dozens of others who each have a personal story to tell. I've certainly heard many of them, so I really appreciate that. It seems to me clearly, my colleagues, that we need to use our imaginations and our brains to figure out this problem. If it were easy to figure out, somebody would have done it already. It is a hard problem to solve, as our panelists have pointed out. But we've shown that we can do this before in other really difficult problems. We've also shown that we know how to come together in emergencies when we need to. I think Representative Neal pointed out that we did that with the S&L crisis, and we did that when the markets crashed in 2008. We did that with the auto industry. So I just want to after having all of my questions answered by these panelists, I want to just tell you, Senator Hatch and Senator Brown, how much I have faith in our ability to figure this out if we work together. I'm really grateful that we're going to have a coming together shortly with ourselves and our staffs to figure out how we can come up with some solutions. We have one solution on the table of a loan idea. I appreciate Mr. Lynch's comments on this. That's what I think is the best thing, but I really look forward to having that conversation with all of us so that we can come up with a bipartisan solution.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you all for your attendance and participation today. Did we get everybody? I think we did.
Yeah, could I have 20 seconds, Mr. Chairman?
Sure, why don't you take some time?
Yeah, I'll just take less than a half minute. Thank you, Senator Smith. And I think what she said about the loan program, there are a lot of different views on this committee. I think we've seen from testimony from a whole lot of employers, including the U.S. Chamber, representing employers and employers themselves, and experts like Mr. Lynch, that a loan program is certainly viable and can certainly work. We're all open. I think we're all open to everything. It seems that we're going in that direction. I wanted to say Congressman Schweikert's comments about never again, that we do not want to be here and do this 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. So how important that is. And I look forward to working with the staff working in August, with some House members coming back, and at least the 8 senators talking among themselves and working, but the staff driving this. And then in November, we get really serious about putting finishing touches on this issue and absolutely figuring it out. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator Brown. I hope we can do it even before then, but I want to thank everybody for their attendance today and, of course, the participation today. This is This is really a tragedy that we're faced with these problems, but we've got to solve them. And I ask that any member who wishes to submit questions for the record do so by the close of business on Friday, August 10th. Now, I'm grateful for the hard work of everybody on this committee. We're going to solve these problems one way or the other, and I hope that everybody who feels deeply about it will weigh in and help us to do it in the very best way we can. Considering taxpayers, considering other organizations who have not had these problems as much, we're just going to have to face the music here and do the job. So with that, we're learning a lot here from the testimonies, and we appreciate each one of you for coming today and giving us the benefit of your testimony. With that, we'll adjourn until further notice.